Welcome to episode 353 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. Changes have been proposed to de minimis rules for international shipments into the USA. And it's not just the USA that's looking at making changes that will impact on low-value cross-border parcels. Joining me in a moment to discuss all of this and more is Kate Muth, Executive Director at the International Mailers Advisory Group. I'm here with Kate Muth, Executive Director of IMAG. We're coming to you from the floor of Post and Parcel Expo. No, it's Parcel and Post Expo, I should get it right. The Parcel and Post Expo here in Amsterdam. So if there's a bit of background noise, a bit of tooting in the background, it's because we're near the test track. But Kate, we're going to talk about international parcels, and in particular, a few things that have being talked about or are coming into force around the world that will have an impact on cross-border parcels. Let's start with the USA. The White House made an announcement in September relating to de minimis shipments and some change to the rules of the de minimis shipments coming into the USA. Kate, can you start us off by giving us an outline of what's been announced?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Ian. And there's on cue, there's the horn. So you're right. September 13th, the White House came out with what it called a fact sheet, essentially something of a press release laying out what the Biden-Harris administration, some potential actions it would like to take. It's essentially reduce de minimis shipments and try to kind of clean up the lane a little bit. As you know, and we've talked about in the past, so much of this is reliant on good data. But what the administration came out with is a little bit of what we've heard from Customs and Border Protection around the need to collect more data, around the need for HTS codes, giving some more enforcement tools to Customs and Border Protection and the Consumer Product Safety Commission and some of the other federal agencies that have some activity in Customs, ensuring goods are cleared through Customs. But what was especially, I think, newsworthy from the administration's release was this idea of excluding certain goods from de minimis altogether, and the exclusion would apply to, at least as the White House envisions it, because this is actually just not even a proposed rulemaking yet, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but what the administration has recommended is that goods subject to Section 301 tariffs would be excluded from de minimis. And if you'll remember what Section 301 tariffs, you may have heard this term before, these are the tariffs that the Trump administration put on a number of goods coming from China. And at the moment, Section 301, even if they're subject to a 301 tariff, they can still come through de minimis. So this is what the administration proposes. They've also talked about exclusion from de minimis eligibility import-sensitive products. So these are products that wouldn't necessarily just be from China. They could be from anywhere. But if the exclusion for goods subject to Section 301 tariffs, if that were applied, it would affect nearly 70% of imports and about 40% of apparel coming from China. So it would have a huge impact on the channel, and I think it has caused a lot of attention. You've seen a lot of trade press around it, and it's just sort of one piece of an ongoing look at, in the U.S., of changing the de minimis or tightening up some of the customs rules. And Customs and Border Protection is looking to do something. They have a rulemaking that's been imminent. I'm doing air quotes here for about 2 years or so. It feels like it's always close to being released. But what CBP would like to do is focus on what it could do around requiring more data. Again, attended to HTS code, parties getting more data from other parties further in the supply chain, perhaps putting penalties on the value of goods, set at the value of goods, but no less than $5,000, so essentially putting a floor on penalties, and then perhaps even charging a processing fee on packages that are not already subject to a fee of some kind. So something like a $1.50 to $2 package per fee on de minimis shipments. And I know that's a lot of information right there, but I just want to say that all of these are just recommendations and suggestions and a little bit of a public pressure to also get Congress to do something, because I know we talked about this in the past too. There are a number of bills that were introduced in the last two sessions of Congress, include some of these same restrictions, include some of these changes. One bill is an entire customs modernization bill, but they haven't gone anywhere. And our Congress is now in a recess until after the November 5th elections. which they'll come back and do what's called a lame duck session, where they'll just take up sort of urgent matters that need to get done, such as budget, passing a budget and things like that. So there's always a chance that an amendment or what we call a rider could get stuck on another bill, added to another bill, and everyone was wondering, would that be, would a de minimis changes happen in that regard? But the Speaker of the House has said he doesn't expect that de minimis would get taken up.
This is an important conversation for us to have, because in the immediate aftermath of that announcement, there were a lot of hot takes going around saying this is going to have a massive impact on Chinese retailers such as Retailer X and Retailer Y, and then speculation about what might happen with regard to Mexico. But it's not that with that announcement, regulations were put into force. There's a whole load of what should we say? I mean, there's a road to be travelled.
Yes.
And Kate, there are different ways to skin a cat, aren't there? So it's not yet clear which way any future administration would go about implementing changes. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And these are the waning days of the Biden administration, because we're going to have a new president regardless of who wins. And the rulemaking process itself, which is when the administration puts forward a rule in what's our Federal Register and others have official gazettes or whatever, is the official document of the government, there would be a comment period. Oftentimes that's 90 days. There'd be consideration of all the comments, reconsideration of the proposed rule, which would lead to a final rule. I don't know if you know, but the STOP Act was the implementing rules around the STOP Act. So the STOP Act is a law, but the implementing rules were all turned over to CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and they had a rulemaking process. It was what's called an interim final rule. So we still don't have the final rule on the STOP Act. So even though, of course, the STOP Act is implemented and all of that. And then there's the question of around if it's a rulemaking through the administrative process, that the administration or the executive branch brings into force. Could you really exclude goods from de minimis? That's sort of a debate within the groups within the United States. In other words, does that need to be legislated by Congress? Because only Congress can actually reduce the de minimis level. Could only say we're going from $800 back down to $200. So, some trade lawyers say, yes, the administration has broad authority to do this. Others say, no, that has to come from Congress. So what does that tell you? It would probably lead to a legal challenge if the administration said Section 301 tariffs are removed from de minimis. But I think what all of this is doing is sending a very, very clear signal that this is an issue that will be addressed, I think, regardless of the next administration. It's just, when will it be taken up? So,
and this is hugely relevant to us in the postal sector, because these parcels are coming through postal channels, aren't they?
Yeah, they are coming through postal channels. I mean, they're coming through all the channels, and we've, great presentation that Eric Pong did today on Temu and Shein, and he was really just talking about how they've set up their networks and all of that, and they're already, they're not relying solely on de minimis. They're already setting up warehouses in the U.S. and other countries, and to be closer to destination. They're doing these, nearshoring is a big idea too. So it's not like companies aren't already making the necessary adjustments. When Customs and Border Protection they'll have conversations with the trade, as they call it, the trade, with the private sector, because I think they do really want this to be a cooperative effort and a partnership, because it won't work if the private sector doesn't get on board. So they briefed on what they would like to see in legislation. And it was very similar to what they put forward in their discussions around what a proposed rulemaking will have. And one of the issues that came up was this processing fee of about $2 a package on de minimis shipments not already subject to other fees. So things that come through the express consignment channel are subject to other fees. So someone on the call asked, well, would this apply to postal shipments too, this fee? CBP said, well, we want a level playing field, but we're somewhat restricted in what we can do by the UPU regulations. Now, that's another debate as well, because there are many people who feel that UPU regulations do not override a country's statutory, what they want to put in place for their own security purposes. But it was interesting that CBP said that, because people are like, well, if it doesn't apply to the postal channel and you just shift all of this volume over to another channel that's not as secure, have we really, I'm just saying if that's the perception, right? If it's not as secure. But understandably, the postal channel is different in that you have all these retail products coming in, and it's not as much a known shipper at the very start.
Now, we've talked a lot about the US. It's not just the US that's looking at how they deal with low-value shipments coming from coming into the country. There have been a number of nations just this calendar year, really, that have been implementing changes, whether it's to de minimis or to various regulations concerning e-commerce and things like that. Can you just give us a quick overview, Kate, before we wrap up, of what else is happening out there?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is not just, I think what's interesting is the U.S. is seen as a little bit of an outlier because our de minimis is so high, and of course we import a lot of goods, but this is a trend around the world. I mean, whether it's a country doing it for security purposes or revenue protection, they want to try to collect a little more duties and taxes, whether they're making changes for protectionism purposes to try to help their domestic retailers. We are seeing changes, and they kind of get announced quickly and they then come into effect, not at all like that rulemaking process I just described. They come into effect rather quickly. For instance, Indonesia got a little, I think, somewhat creative and are banning e-commerce on social media platforms. And they're not allowing overseas sellers to operate on domestic e-commerce platforms either. You have Turkey, who just announced in August they're lowering de minimis from €150 down to 30, and customs duties applied at a higher rate for imports versus what's coming from an EU country. Switzerland just said they're going to introduce what's called the deemed supplier model in 2025, which still a little bit of confusion around, but electronic platforms that facilitate goods transactions will be the deemed supplier and have to meet a number of new data requirements and registration requirements. And then in Latin America, I mean, I think the biggest one that's gotten a lot of attention is Brazil's Programa Remessa Conforme, which is an e-commerce compliance program whereby online retailers and marketplaces that sell and ship into Brazil, they register and try to get certification through the program, which gives them a slightly better import tax on the foreign goods that are coming in, and also keeps the state duties at a uniform rate versus having a different duty in each Brazil state, and it tries to streamline the customs process, but that also requires quite a cumbersome process to apply. If the online retailer has to supply a lot of data and information, you have to have a carrier that's been approved as well. And then we just heard about Mexico. I'm still kind of trying to understand all of the information, but they're going to start restricting, at least for the commercial, for the express channel, the commercial channel, 2,500. It's going to be limited for I guess, informal entry, 2,500 a month or 10 shipments a month. And then there's all these other hoops you have to jump through, or you have to also supply the taxpayer ID for the recipient in Mexico.
Right.
And you can no longer use a generic ID. It's like all these, rules are going on. So I think what I would just stress to your listeners is if you are a cross-border shipper, you really need to probably use a service provider who can take all of this friction. Just happens that I happen to represent a lot of those, but you need to take some friction out of the process so that the shipper and the recipient really don't even need to know what's going on in this whole kind of, portion that's in between the ordering and the receiving. And that's the only way you're going to be sure that the customer experience is seamless and the customer isn't upset at the online retailer on the front end. So yeah, you really need a service provider, you need a third-party tool of some kind. You need something that's going to keep track of all of this and make sure that your shipments, because we know cross-border is such a huge market and the opportunities to grow as an online retailer are just manifold if you can do cross-border. So I think that would be my recommendation, is you sort of let somebody else take care of all that for you, but there is a lot going on.
There is a lot going on, and it is an ongoing discussion. It feels like it all kicked off all those years ago, when we had when then President Donald Trump took up the cudgels on behalf of American manufacturers who saw their products being, or interpreted their products as being what?
A little bit of a market distortions, I guess, a bit of unfair competition. If you could come in, and get a really low terminal dues rate, it wasn't giving a chance for, and you're paying more than for a domestic shipper to send it from 2 states over or something. So yeah.
It's like a continuation of that in many respects. It's governments grappling with, as you mentioned before, grappling with cross-border e-commerce, and whether they're trying to create a level playing field, or whether they're just trying to raise revenue, or whether they're looking for a security aspect. Anyway, nobody needs to hear me editorialise about all this. What I can say, I think with a great degree of certainty, is we're going to see more of this, regardless of what flavour of government is in whatever country in the world. It's going to be an ongoing discussion, isn't it?
It's regulation, and as you said, for whatever, it's a variety of reasons, and you want to be compliant. We as a shipper, you want to be compliant. As a service provider, you need to be compliant. Ultimately, this is for the good of the citizens of a country, right? Presumably, the regulations are being put in place to protect consumers, to protect citizens, to ensure that what's coming across borders is safe, secure, and is meeting their tax requirements. But so we have to be compliant. But it is fast moving. It's changing almost daily. An existing country pops up with some new rules. So, there's a lot to sort out.
Kate Muth, thanks for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
Thank you very much, Ian.
That's all for this episode of the Postal Hub podcast. Remember to subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast platform, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or one of the many others, the multitude of podcast platforms that are out there. Subscribe, leave a review, give it a rating. 5 out of 5 rating would be great. All that sort of stuff. If you want to also subscribe to my email newsletter, go to thepostalhub.com and follow the links and you can sign up for my email newsletter that I send out whenever I release a new episode. There's also the Daily Delivery Digest and other bits and pieces over there. You can follow me on LinkedIn. Just look for Ian Kerr and a very old profile photo of me. You can then follow me and get all my wonderful LinkedIn updates in your social media feed. And if you want to email me about anything at all, but preferably something related to postal or delivery, my email address is ian@thepostalhub.com. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.